the city in order to join the leadership of the FMLN as they fly into San Salvador, what, tomorrow or on Saturday?
Tomorrow morning.
What is it that you expect and they expect immediately upon their return? In other words, let's look at the very near future, the next few days. Is it really likely to go without trouble?
I think there's a chance that it will. I think the word, really a miracle isn't out of line talking about what's going on in Salvador right now. President Cristiani is going to meet these guys on Saturday morning at a national ceremony of reconciliation, and on Sunday they're going to be allowed to go back to the war zones where they fought for a decade to meet their own followers. That's unimaginable in the context of Salvador in the last 10 years. I spent the last few weeks in Salvador, both with guerrilla commanders in the countryside and with people in the capital, and there is a palpable longing for peace. Doesn't mean gunmen can't come in and shoot some people, but there's a tremendous feeling that the war should end.
And Ambassador White, explain for us, if you would, the quite extraordinary role that the United Nations is going to be playing, at least in the near future now, in terms of running the country and making sure that that some kind of settlement is ultimately reached.
The real hope for this peace, making this peace a success, or this peace agreement a success, lies with the United Nations and the 1,000-man plus observer force that will be stationed there, and in effect monitoring both the government forces and the FMLN, making certain that no human rights violations occur, or if they do, that blame is assigned. I think that with that presence there, yes, there's a real chance that this can work. I would say I expect that UN presence to be there for several years.
Well, I was about to ask you, Mr. Abrams, to take us that next step then. How is the final transition then made from what almost becomes a United Nations protectorate for a while to a country that is democratic in every sense of the word and one that manages to combine the warring factions into a unified sort of government?
I think it can happen. I think what happens is that over time you can draw down the number of UN people who are present. What you also need is one good election, honest election, with the FMLN participating as a political party.
Do you agree parenthetically with Ambassador White that the UN will be there for several years?
I think the UN will be there certainly for a year, but I think if you had one national election in which the FMLN was able to participate freely, then everyone would say, look, this is working. We have now worked out a working democracy here. We don't need the UN. So I would say probably for '92 they'll be there, but I'm not so sure they'll be needed after that. I'm really quite optimistic about this arrangement. I think most all Salvadorans of the left and right, as well as the vast group in the center, want this to work. They really don't want the war to start again.
Jim Lemoyne, you picked up on my use of the term miracle and said it's not inappropriate in this case. Why then? Why is it working now? We've focused on the end of the Cold War. Clearly the sort of emotional fatigue that a country has to be going through when it's lost 75,000 of its own. But why now?
I think a couple of things are going on here. One, we forget this war began because elections were stolen in El Salvador. El Salvador had a democratic experience that went sour in the 70s. And they had very authentic political parties of the left and the center. They participated, and the elections were stolen from them. A number of guerrillas participated in that, and they're willing to try again. Secondly, as Mr. Abrams has said, in the last decade, they've had several clean elections in the context of a war, but people have participated, and they've seen that it works. I mean, the Arena party that runs the country was once basically run by death squads. By having to face an electorate, they've had to become more moderate. The same is going to happen with the guerrillas. I say miraculous because it's a peculiar moment in which the end of a major conflict between superpowers and these kinds of political movements have come together, and I think it could be a kind of precedent for the region.
President Cristiani has asked for a little bit shy of $2 billion over the next 2 years, I think it is, Mr. Abrams, from particularly the United States, to help them out, to get them started. They really do need a jump start into some form of economic sanity. I was posing the question to Mr. Abrams. A, do you think they're going to get it? And B, do you think they need quite that much?
Well, there's no magic to the number 2 billion. Yes, I think they're going to get a substantial amount of aid. If we turn all our economic and military aid into economic aid and get the Japanese and the Europeans to contribute, and above all, the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank, I think it ought to be possible to put together a very large package like that. And I don't think they're going to need it for 5 years. I think the economy will start recovering very fast.
Well, they're only asking for it, Ambassador White, for 2 years. What is it you think they're going to be able to do over those 2 years to get things economically, back on an even keel?
El Salvador has a very enterprising private sector that can make money and can start the productive wheels turning. I have no doubts that, the private sector will make its contribution. The real problem is they have to rebuild the bridges that have been blown up, the power stations that have been damaged. They have to begin to educate their children. That young gorilla that you showed us that only had gone to the 2nd grade, I mean, that's a very common thing in El Salvador. So there's a tremendous amount of catching up that El Salvador has to do, and I believe we have an obligation to help them.
Is there a lingering sense, Mr. Lemoyne, of bitterness both toward the Soviet Union and the United States? I mean, is there a sense in that country, and I know we went over the discussion of whether it was a genuine civil war or not, without getting into that argument again, clearly it was also a playground for the superpowers in their Cold War. Is there lingering resentment in El Salvador about that?
There's resentment, but it's not very deep. I went to a few villages that were in the middle of the war zone a few weeks ago that were tremendously ravaged by this war. And these are people who lost virtually everything. And I was amazed at the desire that they have to get that behind them. They asked the American ambassador to come to the village to talk to them. The head of the U.S. military group went to the village and talked to guerrilla commanders in that village, and he was received with open arms. There is a desire among these people to get on with it. And it's one of their greatest qualities as a people, and I think that that resentment won't be part of the future.
So again, to end where we began, and I'll leave the last word to you, Mr. Lemoyne.
There is a house